The Emperor watch over you.
Open fire, all vessels, the Commodore shouted. Torpedoes simultaneous launch, 5,000 miles spread, echelon left. Reload and prepare second volley.
Rostov was right. The enemy relied too much on their warp craft. Athergay thought, now they are dead in the water. A single ship awaited them, towing behind it a large asteroid upon which was mounted the Blackstone Device. Scans revealed no other weapons. Athergay exulted in their attack. The ambush was a complete success. The enemy were caught unprepared. Several million miles away, Van Leskus was attacking the principal fleet of the Crusade force, preventing them from turning back. The first light of their combat had yet to reach Battle Group St. Asta, but astropathic messages confirmed the Fleet Tertius main body had engaged. The buzz of combat mingled with the stim rush in her blood, making it fizz with excitement. The sense of inadequacy Van Leskus gave her burned away. It was her fight. She was in command. The ships bumped unevenly through the wake of the enemy craft as they approached from the rear. Their target ploughed up reality, leaving the terrain of the Tempest Materium deformed behind it, causing the engines of the St. Asta to howl and its frame to scream. The hellship that pulled the Blackstone Device had its stern to them and could bring no guns to bear. Initial auger soundings seemed correct regarding the asteroid, for no weapons locks were detected. They raced forward, guns charging, void shields on, engines at full motive. On a subchannel of the intraship Vox, she heard the masters of the Mechanicus exchanging hurried data blurts. They sent advisements for caution her way, not to overstress the systems, but she ignored them. She ignored Rostov also, who stood at the front of her command dais in full battle dress, stroking his beard thoughtfully, as if he owned the vessel. Lastly, she ignored the priests who stood in large congregation right in front of the Oculus, moaning and wailing and getting on her nerves. Athergay did not like priests, but the St. Asta's episcopus had insisted, and Rostov had indicated that divine help might not go amiss. As far as she was concerned, Episcopus Barandus could go hang, but one disregarded an inquisitor's hints at one's peril.
Vox Lexica reports strike craft ready to launch, reported her fleetmaster of squadrons. Tell them to hold until we are close, Finula said.
All ships report second salvo of torpedoes ready to launch, said the fleetmaster of ordnance.
Hold fire, Finula said. Let's see what the first round does before we loose. No, let them fly, said Athergay. There's no point conserving our munitions. Fire them now.
The St. Asta shuddered as the second volley of torpedoes eased themselves free. Their faint lines appeared on the tactoliths, such subtle marks to denote building-sized missiles. They attained maximum velocity quickly, following the narrow spread of those that preceded them.
The target is accelerating, reported Lieutenant Donbass. Maintain intercept speed, Athergay said. Augury control. Any sign of warp engine engagement?
None, Madam Commodore. It does not appear to be about to flee.
Gunnery decks report readiness, the St. Asta's Master of Ordnance shouted.
Gunnery decks on coming light and on merciful are ready, the Fleet Master of Ordnance added.
Hold all fire. Hold all launches. Maintain intercept speed, Athergay commanded.
The enemy is increasing reactor flow, the chief helmsman voxed from the nested stations near the front of the deck.
Then increase our reactor output. Chase them down, Athergay ordered. All ships to follow. Maintain formation.
Within milliseconds of her order being relayed to the enginarium, a countered objection arrived in her eyepiece, the binaric automatically translated into Gothic Vox script. She blinked it away without reading it. The St. Asta shook. Its power systems whined as energy flooded them to near maximum capacity. Every ripple in space made the ship's frame squeal, but Athergay had her prize in sight. A group of torpedoes blew, caught in the reality shear of the rift. The rest flew on. Athergay listened to the interplay between her lieutenants on the command dais, how their orders radiated out to the subsidiary stations across the deck, then on to the other ships in her flotilla. But her attention was mostly on the main hololiths. The ocular shutters remained closed, for the rift opened directly onto the warp, and though shrouded by veils of disintegrating matter, to look into it risked madness. She saw the rift as a river of red, a simple triangle cutting across space, but even represented by so innocuous a graphical form, it projected supernatural menace that had the hair prickle at the nape of her neck. For all the danger posed by the rift, only 2 enemy returns from the auger were displayed upon the tactical orb, the hellship and its asteroid. 5 cruisers and their attendant escort ships were a considerable force, and in normal circumstances an enemy of such weakness would be overpowered, but Athegay had undergone a rapid re-education since the days of blindness. She had seen things in the many battles the St. Aster had fought that should not be possible. This was going to be one of those occasions. "We are gaining again," the chief helmsman voxed her. 80,000 miles and closing. 500-mile gain per second. "Ready all weapons," Athegay said. "Prepare to launch fleet strike fighters. When we are within striking distance, bring the fleet to 5,000 miles above the plane of the rift." She activated a counter that rapidly fell towards 0 as the ships approached their target. In the main tactical hololiths, the pulsing dots marking the warp machine and its tow grew larger. The thin lines of the torpedoes arrowed towards them. "The enemy are slowing," Fionnuala said, looking back over her shoulder. "They're not running. They mean to fight." She too had battle excitement in her eyes. "All hands, prepare for immediate contact," Athegay said. "Helm, begin elevation of the fleet over the main target." She ground her teeth. Her muscles were cramping. Time for another dose. Without thinking, she pulled her stim tin from her jacket, opened it, and pushed a pinch of the narcotic into the space between her lower lip and teeth, numbing the gum and sending a delightful thrill up her tongue. Fionnuala shot her a disapproving look. Athegay shook her head at her lieutenant to head off any rebuke, and the woman went back to her work. Orders were passed out through the fleet. The St. Aster rose rapidly over the plane of the hellship's progress. Athegay watched her vessels lift over the red triangle until she judged they were sufficiently distant. "That should be safe enough," she said, standing from her seat. The input cables for the ship's systems dragged at her eyepiece, but she adjusted her stance to accommodate it in order to present as determined a pose as she could. "Open the shutters." Red lumens pulsed as the shutters swiveled open and retracted into their housings. Work faltered on the deck as the crew looked out at what faced them. The rift spread out beneath the St. Aster from the hellship ahead. They had been calling it a wake, and it indeed looked like that of an ocean vessel sailing luminous seas. The vivid red and orange churn of energies fanned out from the asteroid as white water follows a ship. There the similarity ended, for the cut resembled a path of blood cut across the sky and bathed the command deck in dismal, bloody tones. The ship itself was but a speck of dirt in a wound. They were close into it now, and it held its shape, ceasing its chameleonic shift from nightmare to nightmare. From their position, the ship seemed a metal sliver, the asteroid a wink of light at its tail, the sharp edge of the blade gutting reality. "Auguries, lock on to the targets. Present magnified true-picked view of primary target," Athegay ordered. 2 of the subsidiary tactiliths shifted perspective, projecting images of the ship and the asteroid separately. Though it possessed engines and moved like a ship, the vessel did not appear like other craft. It was a long, scabbed lump, like the excrescences found crusting the hides of void whales. More organic in shape than mechanical, though here and there random-looking pieces of machinery protruded. It was ugly as its purpose, a deadly cancer on the fabric of the universe. Scans failed to penetrate its skin. The few readings returned were confused garbles of nonsense data, relayed by screaming machines whose operators moved quickly to shut them off. Preposterously, the ship drew the asteroid by means of gargantuan chains, with links as big as strikecraft. Auger returns told Athegay these were of brass, though they were blackened by contact with the void, and bled torrents of blood constantly from every link. The chains were attached by hooks sunk so deep into the flesh of the ship that only their tips were visible, protruding from torn skin metal that wept pus. The asteroid appeared almost normal by comparison, a dirty lump of rock and ice several miles across and almost as many high. Sun-worn spires of frozen water reflected the boiling energies of the warp spreading out behind it, giving them the appearance of flames caught in a single moment. Around it danced clouds of what looked like dust, but which Athegay suspected was anything but. The central tactilith focused on their objective, an immense machine of shattered black obelisks arranged into the 8-pointed wheel of chaos. Its operation made no sense to Athegay, like all the blasphemies of the heretics. "That's it," Rostov said, resting his hands upon the railing at the front of the dais. "The Blackstone Device." The first spread of torpedoes were gaining on the asteroid, rushing at it like the wrath of the Emperor himself. No defensive fire blasted out to meet them, and they approached without hindrance. "No defences, no void shielding," said Fionnuala. The torpedoes tracked the asteroid on perfect courses.
"This might be easier than we thought," said Athagay.
Rostov, his eyes fixed on the prize, shook his head gently, but did not speak. The Master of Ordnance spoke up. "Torpedo impact in 3, 2, impact." The crew shielded their eyes as 24 Helios-class fusion torpedoes impacted with their target. Brilliant blue-white light cast everything on the command deck into flat monochrome as heavy atoms in the warheads were forced together, unleashing the power of suns. Athagay blinked after images away from her human eye. The asteroid had taken very little damage. A plume of vapour trailed it, and a bite had been taken from the rearmost part. That was all.
"We have some teeth at least," said Athagay. "Why are we reading no void shields on the target?"
"You won't see any," said Rostov. "It is protected by the warp itself."
"Psi Oculus, I want readings on what happens when the second volley impacts," Athagay ordered.
At an obscure station on the far side of the deck, several pale men rushed to oblige. The second spread of torpedoes hit the asteroid and exploded to similar result.
"The Inquisitor is right. There is a warp field around the asteroid,"
the Master Seer of the Psi Oculus reported.
"Surely that should show up on our auguries. What is a warp field but a void shield produced by unclean means?"
"Natural law has little sway here," said Rostov. "Our machines are next to useless. Only faith will prevail." He picked up a rosary hanging around his neck and kissed the central amulet.
"Commodore, I am reading multiple targets being, moving away from the orbit of the asteroid. They're... Clarify," demanded Athagay. "They're not ships. I am struggling to get a clear return on them." "Then give me a visual," she demanded, though she guessed what they were before she saw them.
A grainy image, magnified many times, was brought into being upon a large, ornately framed screen that floated down from the high ceiling. The view was full of creatures. Where there was no air, they flew, wings beating against nothing, moving as if they were avians in any planet's sky, and yet they moved with the speed of void fighters, coming directly at the ship so fast the targeting arrays struggled to maintain a lock. Some of them were in harness, galloping in space, dragging skull-shaped chariots behind them, ridden by leering horned figures carrying black swords. Although Athagay was prepared for something like this, still the sight of the Neverborn made her head spin. On the bridge, several crew gave involuntary moans of terror.
"Impossible," said Fionnuala.
Her eyes strayed to the 15 Space Marines waiting in silent ranks at the rear of the deck. Though she disliked being around them, she was evidently grateful they were there.
"You know better than to say that, my dear, after all we've been through these last months," murmured Athagay. "Shut down that image. Put out a fleet-wide alert. All armsmen, billeted troops and Space Marines to prepare for boarders." "Rostov," she said, "they may have no escort, but we'll never bring all those things down before they are on us."
"We must be strong," he replied, seemingly more to himself than to her. They were in lance range of the hellship, and her officers gave the order to fire. Laser beams flashed across the immensities of space. This time she saw it, the queasy shimmer of the warp around the ship and the asteroid. Her fleet had them boxed in, a perfect firing solution, but the great cannons had little impact on either asteroid shrine or ship. Alarms bleeped, and reports came up of more demons emerging from the rift to the rear.
"This could be a trap," said Athagay.
"If it is, I'm going to spring it," said Rostov. "Messinius's men are ready for a ground assault. It is time to see how effective these new Space Marines are in battle. I and my followers will join them." He bowed. "The enemy will not stop coming until the rift is closed. We will have limited time to achieve our objective before we are overwhelmed, so do what you can to keep them from us. Every second will count."
"As you require, Inquisitor," she said.
"Good luck, Commodore Athagay," Rostov said. "May the Emperor protect you." Chapter 33. An Invitation to Battle. Null Maiden. Hellship. They were making Lacranti go with them to the surface. It hadn't been framed in quite so bald a way. It had been more of an invitation than an order, but he had enough sense to see what was expected of him. Besides, he was a soldier. What else was he going to do but fight? There were several Inquisitors attached to Van Lescas's fleet. Rostov had spent the few days at Hydrafer in shadowy conclave with his fellows. New equipment had arrived soon after at the Inquisitor's quarters. Some of it was for Lacrante, which surprised him. "I'm not one of you," he'd said, as he unpacked weaponry of a quality he'd never thought he'd touch. "Don't you want to fight?" said Antoniato. "Yes," said Lacrante, and meant it. "But I could return to my regiment to do that. What's left of it," he said. "They're joining Fleet Tertius." "Why do that?" said Antoniato. "We suffered some back on Fomor 3 and before. There were more of us. We need new blood."
"Banka, Fizament, Folu, all dead. Dyer, too,"
Chilka said. She sat on the floor, scrimshawing a finger bone with her knife. Lacrante had no idea if these were human or Xenos names, or if it were a human or a Xenos finger. "We all have to die sometime," said Antoniato.
"And here I am, still stuck with you,"
said Chilka. Antoniato grinned at her. "Come on, it's good to have some more backup," he said. "We like you, Lacrante."
"Yeah,"
said Chilka, with deeply sarcastic good cheer.
"come along and die with us."
"Why let me? Rostov knows nothing about me," said Lacrante. Chilka clucked her tongue and shook her head. "He's a psyker," said Antoniato. He draped a comradely arm around Lacrante's shoulders. It was an easy gesture for him, probably normal on his world. Displays of intimacy like that was certainly not common on Lacrante's, and he tensed uncomfortably. Antoniato either didn't notice or didn't care. "He can tell if a man has a good heart the moment he meets him. He can move without being seen." He patted Lacrante's left breast. "And—"
"Some of his gifts we don't talk about,"
said Chilka warningly. Antoniato shrugged. Lacrante wondered what Rostov's other ability was as he followed the Inquisitor down a quiet access corridor to one of the St. Asta's flight decks. Chilka wore a weird void suit that looked like it was made from stitched leather, with 2 inset glass lenses covering her eyes. She carried the backpack she had on Fomor 3. He and Antoniato wore advanced carapace armor. It was environmentally sealed. The grey undersuit was made of tough carbon weave fabric, and the articulated plates, which covered more of the body than the war gear he was used to seeing, were painted matte black. There were no markings on it except for a tiny golden Inquisitor's eye on the left shoulder pad. He carried a hotshot lasgun, still getting used to the weight of the power pack slung beneath his armor's systems unit on his back. Antoniato had his sun gun, Chilka her alien firearms, while Rostov had added gauntlets and a helmet to his carapace armor. Chilka whistled a jarring tune. Otherwise, the corridor was totally silent. Rostov reached a door and held out his ringed hand to it. The ring sat outside his gauntlet, seeming to have grown to accommodate the extra width. The door opened on the raging activity of a hangar deck. Rostov strode past the sentries guarding the door. Automated gun emplacements scanned him and let them pass. Several blocky Space Marine gunships were ranged on turntables, facing directly away from the shimmering atmospheric field that screened off the hangar entrance. Rostov headed directly towards one, passing the Space Marine guards without comment, and boarded. Lacrante paused. He had never been inside an Adeptus Astartes craft. Antoniato nudged him hard in the back. "Up you go," he said, cheerfully. The ship was full of Space Marines standing in 3 ranks of 10, their boots magnetically locked to the floor, eye lenses glowing in the half-light. 4 acceleration seats had been prepared for the Inquisitor and his retinue near the front ramp. They buckled themselves in. A klaxon sounded. A slender woman in armor ran aboard, coming close to Lacrante as she did. He got an impression of a shaved head with a long topknot, a face blanked off by some kind of muzzle, a sword. But his view was fragmentary, like she was hard to see all of a piece, and he was permitted only to glimpse aspects of her, never the whole. She had an unpleasant aura, and he felt his stomach cramp as she brushed past his knee. The Space Marines opened up to let her through, and she hurried up the short rise to the flight deck. Boots clanked on the decking as the Adeptus Astartes took up their places again. Antoniato rapped on the helmet of his carapace suit. "Null Maiden, she'll get us through the warp field," he said. Lacrante looked outside. "Hey!" he shouted. They communicated using squad vox, but the rumble of idling engines and shouts of ground crew outside was deafening, even through the armor. "Isn't that Lord Lieutenant Massinius?" "Yep," said Antoniato. "Didn't you tell me only he and the others in the privacy field know Rostov's big secret? What if we all die? There's 2 of them on this mission, 3 if you count the Commodore." Antoniato shrugged. They've got their ways, these inquisitors. The story will get out somehow, if he needs it to.
A klaxon began to honk, and machinery beneath them jerked to life with a short grinding. The Thunderhawk lurched into a slow turn. More klaxons started up as the other attack ships rotated on their turntables. The ship crawled around, the hangar entrance swinging into view. The ship stopped with a judder, and LeCrunte looked out into space. The rift had been awful enough from the distance of a planet's surface. Up close, it was insane, a riot of horrible colours, all vying for his attention. Lightning flashed in the clouds of glowing gas spilling around it, and there were other things he could see, glimpses of demonic faces as tall as moons, and showers of blood. He felt nauseous and screwed up his eyes to shut out the images. It didn't work. Somehow it made it worse. He could still see them, and now he felt they could see him. He quickly opened his eyes again. Clouds of dots were flying up from the asteroid towards the fleet.
That's as close as you'll ever get to looking directly into the warp. It's probably not safe at this distance, even so shrouded like it is here, shouted Antoniato. If you can, avoid looking back down the wake of the ship. Further back, the amount of real stuff diminishes, and the edges of the Imperium will be clearer. Don't look at it, whatever you do.
The Thunderhawk shook. Machines inside it made loud protests as the engines roared up to flight speed. The ramp lifted.
When we get down there, you're going to see some crazy shit, said Antoniato. Demons, hereticostates, renegades, whatever. Stay close to me. I can look after myself, said LeCrunte. Hey, the Emperor protects, but it helps if you have one of these.
Antoniato patted the sun gun's stock and grinned. His face was lit up yellow by his helm's internal lights, and he looked ghoulish. He was sweating, and LeCrunte remembered how much he hated flying. Rostov's head was bowed in prayer, his hands clasped around his rosary. Chilka was kicking her feet nonchalantly, Pack gripped by all four arms. LeCrunte could imagine her still whistling inside that hangman's hood she wore as a helmet. The Thunderhawk's engines rose and rose until the noise filled LeCrunte's skull from one ear to the other. One of the gunships lifted up, nose angled forward, claws retracting. It passed through the atmospheric field. Another followed, then another. LeCrunte's last sight of the void before the ramp closed was a clearing barrage launched from the ships, and escort craft racing out of the launch tubes above and below the hangar. Then the ramp clanged shut. The Thunderhawk leaned forward, and it accelerated with a force that punched the air clean out of LeCrunte's lungs. Antoniato moaned, and they raced towards the asteroid. The Thunderhawks rattled like dice cups. Messinius's eyes blurred of the padding in his helm. Lacking the great mass and powerful engines of the warships, the Space Marines' attack craft tumbled through the wake of the Hellship. Through images relayed from the Thunderhawk's vidfeed and displayed on his helm plate, he's racing to meet them. Athagay hopes as close as she dared to the thousands of miles to traverse, and even at the speed that was minutes of tremendous danger. Lasbeams and fusion lancers streaked past them from the fleet. Balls of fire erupted in the hordes from exploding shells, clearing their way. Ahead of the flight of 7 Thunderhawks, 2 strike cruisers flew. They had an easier time negotiating the turbulent currents of disrupted reality, and they too began to fire on the clouds of demons crowding the asteroid. The images leapt around. The close confines of his helm and the manner in which the vidfeeds were generated ordinarily kept them floating in front of his eyes, but the violence of their flight was so pronounced he was reduced to short glimpses of the onrushing horrors. The demons came at them fast, and Messinius saw that most of them rode bizarre chariots pulled by surging beasts which seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The swords held in outstretched hands were real enough. Shells preceding the landing force detonated in a solid wall of fire, consuming the first wave of the demons. The strike cruisers were through first, their weapons firing madly into the endless horde. They could not possibly kill them all. The intent was only to clear a path through. The fire died fast in the vacuum, and the storm of lasfire from the ships cut through those coming after the first wave. There were greater beings among them, winged monsters bigger than dreadnoughts, the lords of Khorne's armies. The Thunderhawk shook hard, whipping the Space Marines around and making them clash off each other as they evaded these larger fiends. Messinius lost sight of the battle for a moment. There were no seats or restraints in these vessels, the hold being empty to carry as many men as possible. Their boots were maglocked, but they were thrown about. Next he saw the enemy were closing in on the 2 strike cruisers. Guns of all kinds blasted at their foes, disintegrating demons before they got in close. Those that did were ripped apart by the void shields.
Attack craft pulled ahead of the Thunderhawks, targeting the larger demons. Then the transport dived hard and vibrated so much that the images on Messinius's helm plates became unreadable smears of light, and he gritted his teeth in anticipation of landing. "The assault force is through the first barriers of the enemy." Lieutenant Gonan was unsure what to call them. "Estimated landing in 2 minutes.
Maintain speed. Pace the enemy ship," said Athagay. "Stand ready to bombard as soon as the warp field is down." Demons were coming at them over space at impossible speed. Their very existence was an affront to reality itself, and she fought off crippling levels of disgust. She passed a quiet order that all close-in pict and vid views of the creatures be minimized or shut down altogether. For now, as they came near to the ships, their headlong charge was brought to a crashing halt by the void shields. Athagay accessed a private view of the things squirming against the barrier, unable to get past the ancient warp technology holding them at bay. They were an endless collage of grotesques, every horrible thing she could imagine exemplified in vaguely human form, expressions of murder and vice, alive and hungry for her soul. Her left hand shook as she reached for her stim tin. "Void shields holding," one of her lieutenants reported. "Madame Commodore, Augury reports massive energy build-up from the target." The message was sufficiently important to sidestep the usual chain of command, and was voxcast directly to Athagay from the augury pits. "Psi-Oculus 2, another man reported. "It's the Noctilith construct upon the comet." Her crew knew better than to signal her unnecessarily, so she switched to the data streams being pushed her way. Lines on graphics danced upwards in ever higher peaks. They were of an unfamiliar, exotic energy pattern, but she recognized the signs of a weapon about to discharge. "Get me visual," she commanded. "Asteroid front and center, maximum magnification." The wheel was whirring about with increasing rapidity. A dark halo built around the obelisks, making it up. It appeared that this adversely affected the rift, as the sickening glow of warp intrusion faded a little. "That's a damn warp weapon," Athagay said. "All ships, brace!" The obelisk stopped, hanging in space over the asteroid. Then a massive pulse of energy burst from them, washing over the demons and rolling out towards the ships. Where it touched the Neverborn, it invigorated them. Space wavered. Short-lived warp breaches flashed into being. It slowed as it encountered resistance from the actuality of the material universe, but still it came, and when it touched the void shields around the lead ship, coming light, it provoked a violent reaction. Light akin to the detonation of a fusion core flashed across the heavens. When it died, the void shields were down, and the demons were surging towards the coming light. Then it was the St. Asta's turn. The energy wave was a rolling front of glass, distorting the battle behind it. It hit, and the void shields winked out. In her eyepiece, Athagay saw the demons screaming in anticipation as they crossed the last few thousand yards to the ship's metal hull. That would not stop them. "Get the voids back up now," she commanded. Machines howled as they were bullied into cooperation without the correct placatory incantations. A cacophony of reports competed for attention. "The Neverborn, ma'am. Enemy closing 3,000 yards. Blackstone Device is powering for another pulse." She heard only one voice properly, that of Lieutenant Diomed. "We've another problem," Finula reported, and summoned a floating image of the enemy vessel towing the asteroid. "The Hellship is breaking free." Millennia ago, the ship had been given the name Duke Randall. That no longer had any meaning, neither of the materium or the immaterium. It was an abomination, a fusion of matter and extra-dimensional malice, a machine possessed by an evil spirit, a demon ship. It slowed. The need to pull its burden through space was superseded by more immediate concerns. Firefly souls danced through the cold night of the world of dust, baiting it, demanding they be devoured. The demon ship had no crew. Corridors and chambers where men and women had once spent their entire lives were full of rotten matter, analogues of arteries and lymphatic systems, a mocking pastiche of mortal anatomy. In its own way, the demon ship was alive, its animus taken from the warp so long ago and bound within the steel halls of man's artifice that it no longer thought of itself as a thing of the warp. Merged with its monstrous spirit were the caged spirits of the ship's complement, human and machine both, screaming constantly as their energies raced through corroded circuits. It stopped. A quivering passed over its flanks. The chains attaching it to its burden shook. The hooks plunged into its body moved for the first time in eons. It felt something akin to pain. The ship convulsed like a sick dog, the chains shaking, the hooks working free from flesh steel. Some of the firefly things spat at it, peppering its body with metal and hot light, but this only speeded the shedding of the chains. Strange structures within its flesh tugged out barbs and forced back the hooks until, with a slithering rush and a wash of demonic fluids, the first came free. Another hook followed, then another, until only one remained. Unable to wait any longer, the ship fired its engines at maximum, the sudden acceleration ripping out the last hook and tearing a bloody gash down its side. The hellship flew free, its spine flexing like that of some gigantic pelagic animal, engines flaring a dirty red. It executed a maneuver that would have snapped a normal vessel in two, doubling back upon itself and coming to a new heading with a muscular twist at an acceleration unattainable for anything truly real. The skin of the ship cracked and sloughed off, revealing a vile thing of gaping, tusk-ringed orifices and flayed muscle nestled between pitted towers and ruined guns. Ancient statuary peered out from enfolding flesh, every face contorted into a horrified scream. The prow split, shattering what little resemblance the thing had to a ship. The ram section exploded outwards in a shower of metal and blood. A long muzzle, like that of a skinless canid, was beneath. It opened, showing teeth and a tongue. The rest of the ship was a revolting assembly of rotting body parts and corroded metal, but the tongue was incongruously healthy, slick, and pink with unholy life. Slit-pupilled eyes blinked gummy fluids away. A look of cunning passed through them. A sole imperative flashed through the corrupted circuits of its cogitator network, born in the viscid brain that occupied its command deck, gathering in the places where the holy work of Mars met warp-born meat, sorcery met technology, and the divine met the diabolical. Hunt. It wanted to hunt. Lacrante's head throbbed, and images of doom plagued him when they passed the warp shields. He was still reeling when the Thunderhawk landed with bone-jarring force, and both fore and aft ramps slammed down. Antoniato gripped his arm, preventing Lacrante from rising and being crushed by the Space Marines. The Adeptus Astartes ran out with their guns held ready. The last were already firing before they hit the dirt of the asteroid. The Inquisitors group was patched into the Space Marines' Vox network, and Lacrante listened to them as they dealt with the few enemy at their landing site. They spoke little, their reports to one another and commands to the point. The chugging boom of bolt fire echoed up the ramp, lessening in volume slightly as the Space Marines pushed out to form a perimeter. There were other weapons firing, and the roar of Voidcraft touching down. Chilka got out of her seat and put her pack on.
Gravity normal, for humans at least,
she said.
There's an atmosphere too,
said Antoniato. Chilka huffed.
So we'll just get shot rather than suffocate, and when we're dead, we'll fall down properly instead of just floating away. Marvelous.
Her short fingers moved over a series of studs on her rifle's side. A glass blister glowed blue.
Move out,
said Rostov. They marched down the ramp and out into the battle. The asteroid's landscape wasn't what Lacrante had expected. Antoniato had told him the truth of the cultists who bedeviled the Imperium, and he expected to see all manner of barbarity. Instead, he saw a lot of machinery. It was strange-looking, but there were no monsters or hideous mutants, the character of the place being technological rather than supernatural. The demons were absent from the surface. The few not engaged in the void battle wheeled beyond the warp shields, but did not pass through its faint curve of oily light.
Huh,
said Chilka.
It looks like they can't get in.
Those things out there are rage incarnate, said Antoniato. It's probably not a good idea to have them roaming about around your doomsday weapon, don't you think?
Chilka's chattering laugh blended with the sound of Space Marine guns. The asteroid was a nothing place, a crumbling surface of compacted void dust around an iron core. Dirty pillars of ice thrust up from the ground. Between these, power conduits snaked to portable units. There were two machine groups visible from their position, possibly an atmosphere generator and a gravity stabilizer. The Thunderhawks had landed in a crater scooped out of the asteroid's side. It made a partial sphere, with steep walls that were ragged around the top. The Space Marine strike cruisers stood off, seemingly close enough to touch, and battled on all sides by the demons in the void. The sickening glow of the rift shone over the foreshortened horizon, and the Thunderhawks lobbed shells in that direction from battle cannons elevated to clear the lip of the crater. The Space Marines were pushing out. So far, all Lacrante and the others could see of the enemy were red splashes where they had been dismembered by bolt weaponry.
There were fragments of machinery mixed in with some of the mess that might have been augmetics, but the foe had been so comprehensively killed it was hard to tell if they'd even been human. Rostov led them at a fierce stride. All the Thunderhawks were down, and the last of the Space Marines were disembarking. There were a couple of hundred of them all told. One or two were intimidating, but so many together were frightening. They ran past, their armour growling, plates clashing, and Lacrante dodged aside in case they trampled him underfoot. Rostov made for a group of officers gathered about Messinius. There were communications and medical specialists, a couple with the trappings of Space Marine warrior mystics, and a skull-faced chaplain in black. Messinius turned from his warriors and began his report as soon as Rostov came close, shouting to be heard over the report of the Thunderhawk cannons. "Inquisitor, we have secured a perimeter just past the ridgeline." He pointed to the edge of the crater. "As yet, enemy resistance is minimal, mostly human dregs. That one was an acolyte of the Dark Mechanicum." He pointed at the splash of blood and flesh scraps around the broken augmetics. "What of the heretic Astartes?" Rostov asked. Lacrante's heart skipped a beat at the name. He had no desire to face them again. "Power emissions suggest they are dug in around the device. We are struggling to get clear readings on their numbers, even though we are within the warp shield." Messinius looked up. "We need to get the warp shield down so the remainder of the strike force can make a landing. Without support and resupply, we will not hold long. We have a maximum of 10 minutes ammunition supply at moderate fire rates." "Your group is ready?" "Yes, Inquisitor," said Messinius. Lacrante noticed he kept glancing at Chilka, who stared steadfastly at him. "Sergeant Totven here will lead the attack on the generator. We'll act as a block until his objective is achieved. When the warp field comes down, we will be exposed to the Neverborn. We have to be in position to move on the device as soon as possible, and then we must be quick," Rostov said. "If Dyer's theories are correct, we can undo a great deal of harm here." A group of Space Marines walked past, bearing heavy crates between them. Others were setting up mobile sentry guns to guard the approaches to the crater and communications equipment at its center, not far from the traitor's environmental machines. "This will serve as our beachhead," said Messinius. "In case we find ourselves mired in heavy fighting, we can fall back here. It's good ground to hold if we need to wait for reinforcement from the main fleet. They will not evict us from this asteroid. If your plan can be achieved, it will be. If not, the fleet will be free to bombard the Blackstone Device from existence. We will be victorious," said Messinius, certainly. "All that matters is the degree of our success." Messinius saluted the Inquisitor and bowed his helmet. It was a ridiculous sight, so huge and heavily decorated a warrior paying respect to so comparatively small a figure. Messinius issued orders to his men, and they dispersed. "We move now," said Rostov. Within his helm, a respirator mask covered the lower part of his face, and the view of the rest was restricted by the narrowness of his visor. The determination in his eyes was clear nonetheless. Messinius took the lead up a fan of loose material, heading to a notch in the crater wall. Powdered dust slumped under the Space Marine's weight, burying Lacrante up to his knees in regolith chilled by millions of years of exposure to the void. The Space Marines made it to the top quickly, aided by their armor's supplementary muscle systems. Rostov moved so easily he must have had some sort of strength boost built into his own battle gear. Antoniato sidestepped every rush of pebbles and dust like he foresaw their coming. Only Lacrante and Chilka struggled. She stumbled in front of Lacrante while he was tugging his boots out of the sand. He was out quick enough to help her up. He expected a sharp comment in return, but, gasping a little, she thanked him, and he helped her get to the top of the slope. Her bag was heavy, and he took half the burden by hauling on the strap at the top. They were both panting by the time Antoniato doubled back and helped them up the last few feet. "What's in there?" asked Lacrante.
"You don't want to know,"
said the little alien. The ground levelled off. At first, the view was obscured by the looming backs of the Space Marines, but they parted, splitting into different units. Rostov's small crew could see to the heart of the asteroid, where stood the Blackstone Device. 8 shaped pieces of blackstone, like spearheads, hundreds of yards long, rotated around a central hub carved with a giant eye, looking like a massive arcane compass rose. They had no physical supports, but floated in the air on crackling arcs of energy. The hub and the spears bore the marks of different hands. The hub, being newer, was more roughly hewn. The 8-pointed star spun around the axis of the hub, though it did so erratically in both speed and inclination, first tipping one way, now spinning flat, now nearly vertical.
Long trails of green lightning danced around it, earthing from the spear tips into the ground. A vortex of what Lacrante could only think of as black light twisted over it, pulling the warp field down towards the hub of the wheel. Thunder boomed erratically. It was of a scale that was difficult for the human mind to comprehend, and Lacrante wondered why they could not see it from the crater when they should have been able to. It was all wrong, unreal. His head throbbed, and he tasted a taint on the air, metallic and sour. He could smell something dusty, but no matter how many times he checked his environmental settings, they assured him that his air supply was clean. A squad of Space Marines joined Messinius. 40 more warriors ranged themselves over the slopes. Together, they all descended the ice-strewn hillside to the center of the asteroid. Between the ridge and the device, there were thick vapors flowing over the ground, and in them was movement. Their advance would be contested.
"It's an abomination," said Rostov. "Xenos science put in service of mankind's greatest foe. That is our primary target. We must undo what has been done." "Totvin," Messinius voxed, "begin your assault, now!"
Chapter 34. Overlord. The Power of Tertius. The Child Inside. War tore into the heavens. Arios watched the battle through the Overlord's augury suites. Dozens of ships were already engaged at close range as the Chaos Captains raced with one another to be the first into the fight. Explosions burst amid squadrons of heavy ships, rippling off void shields and crashing into brass-chased plasteel hulls. Energy weapons fire turned the spaces in between to dancing light shows. Brilliant luminescence of every color flickered from the vessel's sides, from gunfire, explosions, engine blocks, and void shields. 3 enemy cruisers ran ahead of the pack, their arrowed prows blazing with gunfire. One took the full brunt of a macro cannon broadside. Its shields collapsed around it. 7 lance beams converged on it, coring it out. Gas plumes and explosions erupting along its spine pushed it down, out of formation, forcing one of the others into an evasive roll. The Overlord sped past, rising up high to ride over them. Bombers and fighters flew alongside the Space Marine formation, waiting for counterstrikes. These came soon enough. Starburst patterns of anti-fighter flak shells bursting amid the formation. A couple were hit. Debris smashed into the void shielding of Arios' ship, whiting out his view. Overlords, Thunderhawks, and other gunships scattered, splitting apart, taking fighter squadrons with them. A flight of destroyers cut up through the battlescape towards them, only to be intercepted by 3 waves of bombers peeling off from the attack run and smashed apart. Sword-class frigates pushed on parallel with the Overlord's flight path, their prow lancers sniping at exposed superstructures and wounded enemy vessels. They hit the enemy's own attack craft screens, a combination of demon engines and traitor-piloted starfighters in flocks, and the Imperial squadrons engaged. The boarding craft were targeted, but they were heavily armed themselves, cutting through the enemy with whirling spirals of gunfire, trapping them between their fighter escorts. The Overlord dived, tipping from side to side as it weaved its way between 2 cruisers trading punishing broadsides. Flame wreathed Arios' view, and they were through, the enemy ship above coming apart around them. Their wingmate was hit by a lance beam. Armored figures were flung into the void. Arios wished them luck, for Primaris Space Marines were so hardy some had surely survived. Then they were past that, making a corkscrewing ascent as intersecting las beams tried to pin the Overlord down. Again, its void shield spilled dangerous energy into the warp, and all the while it accelerated, the superhuman reflexes of the Tech Marine pilots driving through maneuvers deadly to unenhanced humans. They punched up through another formation of enemy cruisers. A Nova cannon shell went off several hundred miles away, obliterating the tail section of the Carnage-class cruiser. Explosions chained along its surviving half, driving the point of its prow down towards other ships, passing through their voids and raking open a long gash on the flank of one. Arios felt the stirrings of excitement in his blood, an honest feeling, not born of his adapted metabolism nor the drugs his battleplate provided. The power of Fleet Tertius seemed overwhelming. Everywhere the Overlord turned on its flight, he saw ship after ship pounded apart. But the enemy were firing back, and their own assault cruisers were launching Dreadclaw pods and Gehenna gunships. Wave after wave of torpedoes and attack craft streamed back the way they had come. The destruction inflicted on his own side would be no less dramatic. Their target hove into view, and the Overlord leveled out. Its attendant craft moved back into screening formations.
"Lieutenants," the Tech Marine flight commander voxed, "we are beginning our attack run. Prepare to board." Blood King grew ahead of them rapidly. The 20 ships around it were arranged in good order, and a storm of fire came from them, targeting the assault boats. The Overlord shrugged off most of it, but the Thunderhawks in their group were without void shields, relying on agility to survive. On that last dash, they were vulnerable, and 2 exploded. Covering fire from the Imperial fleet streaked over the assault group, flaring on void shields. They failed to bring them down, but the assault boats would be able to slow enough to pass through, and the discharge of the shields as they displaced incoming fire scrambled targeting systems. A heavy barrage was kept up, and the assault group sped onwards. "Deceleration to penetrate shields commencing. Be ready." The ship fired its retrojets, dropping speed so violently black spots swam in Arios's vision, and he felt his internal organs shift. The void shields washed over them, and the Overlord accelerated again, once more with painful force. Fire intensified towards them, now from point defense guns and swift-moving turrets rather than the main arrays. These were more accurate against strikecraft, but far less powerful, and although the Overlord's single void shield pulsed and sparked, it did not collapse, and they sped on. The Blood King grew massive in his view until its hull filled most of his external input and blurred by. The assault craft split, the surviving support ships streaking off to target weapons systems and comms arrays, the others conveying the Space Marines to their designated boarding points. There was a massive impact, and the Overlord's void shield exploded in a display of purple lightning. Another hit struck the far hull, and for a moment it rolled out of control before the pilots brought it to heel and raced on to their target. It slowed until it was stationary, facing large cargo dock doors patterned with decay. The void shield sprang up again, absorbing the hail of las cannon blasts coming at the ship from all directions. The ship shivered. All its missiles detached, slamming into the cargo lock and blasting it in. Then they were tipping forward, pushing against the gale of venting atmosphere into the breach. The Overlord set down, and all the hatches slammed open. "Move! Move! Move!" Arios commanded. The aggressors went down the front ramp, wading into enemy small arms fire. Shotgun rounds smacked off their reinforced Gravis armor, rattling from them with as much effect as rain on metal roofs. Their bolt storm gauntlets replied, and they advanced forward. The intercessors went out of the back, using their longer-range bolt rifles to lay down suppressive fire. The Hellblasters took shelter behind the aggressors, waiting for hardier troops to show themselves. Arios went down with his command group. Their foes were mortals in void gear, all dead now, their blood freezing on the cooling metal. He pointed to the inner door. "Get the ingress open, split, and head to your objectives." The interior of the airlock was grubby, poorly maintained, but seemingly free of the warp's corruption, although blasphemous symbols were daubed on the walls in blood. He brought up a cartograph of the ship layout. It was a genetic floor pan for the Blood King's original class, and he tasked the Overlord crew with bringing it up to date with auger scans. He looked to the other side of the ship. The front ramp and the first quarter of the hull had been torn off. The metal was blackened and torn. No life signs from inside. "Sergeant Ikwa," he commanded, "check for survivors." Ikwa detached himself from his squad and looked into the ruined hull. "None, brother lieutenant," he said. "Then we're on our own. Form up. Expect heavy enemy resistance." He looked to their target. A few hundred yards away, several decks up, the command deck waited. War was what Arios had been made for. He advanced quickly up a wide corridor towards the command deck main ingress, dodging into cover every dozen yards and covering his men as they moved up behind him. His gun moved precisely to match the motion of his legs, so that his aim was perfect. His armor systems helped him, highlighting the wretches who came at him in dull orange outlines, showing them to be little threat. Bright, infra-rich pictograms hung around their heads, showing that most had been mind-slaved. Though they could not harm him, though they were not objectively guilty of treachery, they were the foe, and they had to die. For each one, he spared only a single bolt, switching with inhuman smoothness from target to target. Bolt motors flashed brightly in his thermal imaging systems. The deaths of his foes were impressionistic splots of short-lived white on the deep blues and greens of the ship's deck. He moved, he killed, but he did not think. Arios went into battle as a passenger in his own mind. For millennia, the hypnomats of Belisaria's call had reworked his being. Until that point, Arios had thought of himself as an extension of the boy he had been. When he went into battle on the Blood King, he saw that for a lie. His body reacted without conscious input from his higher functions. When he came into the main spinal way, he decided to switch to his knife and pistol, only to find his hands had got there first and were already performing death blows to the slaves running screaming towards him. By the time he judged the thermal view too limiting for close melee and the proliferation of informational runes too much, his helm had already switched to standard view, and he saw his foe as he would with his uncovered eyes, the scene colour-corrected by his battleplate cogitator to take out the red tint of the armour glass. An alarm trilled, arrows sliding around the retinal display of his intercessor armour, highlighting a threat coming in from the right. Already he was turning, his bolt pistol raised, firing before he'd even had a chance to process what he saw. Lumbering war servitors equipped with crackling power claws coming to take his head. He had the briefest glimpse of their moronic faces before bolts he was not aware of firing had obliterated them, and he was on to the next target, consciously noting them only after he had killed them. He moved so fast, his own limbs working without his input, and he killed without compunction or hesitation. He had undergone thousands of simulations. He had been sparring since he had woken on the Zarquesitor, and there had been the battle on the Idios. But this was the first time he had killed something that was truly alive. Every one of his foes was a person, even the servitors had been once. Each had their own thoughts, desires, dreams, and fears. Many would be slaves taken from imperial worlds. He killed them just the same. Any moral objection he might have had as a child was gone. War was what he was. He was a living embodiment of mankind's destructive impulse. Ferron was still there, but he was a vestige, clinging on to the shadowy parts of his mind like a ghost, wordlessly watching, and he thought again of the unliving, dishonoured dead of his home. He caught a servitor in the throat with the blade of his left forearm, flipped it over his extended left leg, drew back his sword and decapitated it before it hit the ground. The neck glowed with the contact, and the skull exploded. There were dozens more, pouring out of side doors lit by hellish forge glows, like ants coming out of their nest. As he slew them, as his brothers slew them, he had the awful thought that he was not so different to them. He had not wanted to be taken. He had been snatched from his home and his people and made into a tool for war. He had no control, it seemed then, over what he did. They were all human bullets for a war that would never end. He filed the idea away for later consideration. The last of the servitors fell crashing to the deck, blood, oil, and strange milky fluids spilling from ruptured lines. "Lieutenant!" One of the others was gesturing with a handheld auspex, pointing towards the command deck. In the chaos of the fight, he looked much like all the others, but the rune tag in Arios's retinal display showed him to be Brother Issus. "Strong energy readings that way. Heretic Astartes. Squads 4 and 6, spread out. Hold the rear against counterattacks," Arios commanded. His bolt rifle barked 4 times, and a servitor fell back in pieces into one of the sally holes. "Get those exits blocked up. Crack grenades in all of them. Squads 2, 3, 5, follow me." He brought up a roster of the selected squads. All the outlines of the Battle Brothers showed green, indicating no injuries and no armor damage, but ammunition counts glowed ominously towards the orange-red end of the spectrum. He checked his own counters. 5 in the pistol, 13 in the rifle, 1 additional magazine for each. They had to get the bridge under control. He patched into Issus's Auspex feed and counted upwards of 30 power armor readings, possibly more. There was something else, something large that spooked the short-range sensors of his battleplate, and he had his threat indicators trill an uncertain warning. His mind seemed to shift in his skull, and he came more into himself. A decision had to be made, one that could not rely on reflex alone. Their objective was ahead, but it was heavily defended. What should he do? Situations played a million times in his endless sleep pointed to one conclusion. Though he had to make the choice, there was no real decision involved. He had his orders. "Forward," he said. "Carefully." Chapter 35. Ocean Predator. Warp Field. Totvan's mission. Demons flew screaming at the Centaster. The space around the ship was a mad artist's sketch of searing lines. Point defense turrets put out a constant storm of fusion beams, plasma streams, las blasts, and solid shot. Demons were atomized, their unnatural forms burned from the universe. Their twisted souls screamed back into the warp, further disturbing the fabric of space and time.
Still they came on, an unending horde of red-skinned horrors, propelled into the teeth of the guns by their need for violence. Fighter craft speared through them, opening leads in the teeming mass. The guns of the macro-cannon batteries boomed in series, time fuses detonating their shells in the middle of the demonic swarms. But though tens of thousands were slaughtered, there were more coming, streaming from the depths of the rift in inexhaustible numbers. The Space Marines had made their initial landing upon the asteroid, but their strike cruisers remained embattled in near orbit. Now deep into the Demon Cloud and close by the asteroid, their communications with the fleet were disrupted. Messinius needed to get the warp field down quickly. Athagay brought her attention back to her part of the battle. The demons clogged the battlesphere around the fleet. There were too many to kill, and though the warp tech of the Void Shield seemed to be harmful to them, already they had pushed through and begun to swarm the hulls of her warships. Exterior vid feeds from various parts of the St. Aster showed them tearing at the armor and gathering around airlocks and hangar slots. Teams of Astra Militarum, Space Marines, and her own armsmen waited for them at the most likely points of ingress. She regretted the necessity of sending the Sisters of Silence down with the Thunderhawks. That was not the most pressing concern. The Hellship was coming for them. Demons scattered before it as prey does before a leviathan. It fascinated her, for in many respects it still looked like a ship made by mortal hands, even though its ram had become a set of smiling crocodilian jaws, and wet eyes rolled along its sides where gunnery deck should have been. She could see the command structures on its back, half buried by organic growths, but visible nonetheless. Its stubby main deck shield plates remained of metal, upright, fixed, the faded insignia of Battlefleet Iago still visible on them. But its movements were entirely organic. It flicked its stern from side to side like a tail, swimming through the void as easily as a fish might negotiate the water, and yet its engines still burned with a hideous red light. It was closing rapidly, its speed incredible, the sinuous curves it described impossible for a ship of metal to perform, making its already horrible appearance all the worse. Its rheumy eyes seemed to be staring directly at her, and its smile took on a knowing aspect, as though it wished to share a private jest only with her. Finding herself mesmerized, she snapped herself out of it before its gimlet stare bored its way too deep into her soul. She opened a fleet-wide channel. "All captains, heed this order well. New firing priorities will be provided for long-range main armaments." Fionnuala began commanding the gunnery masters of the St. Aster, the other ships providing firing solutions while the Commodore was still talking. "Destroy the demon ship," said Athagay. A repellent evil afflicted Totvan as he and his men penetrated the warp field machine complex. Warp engines throbbed. The arcane power they projected affected reality, causing his battleplate sensorium to spew junk data through his retinal feeds. They wouldn't be able to get much closer to the main generator than they were, he realized. The warp field acted a little like a void shield, a little like a Geller field, but was more unstable and poisonous than both. He could taste the warp on the air as hot metal and rancid fat. A malfunction or misjudgment, and the field would implode, opening up a short-lived portal to the warp proper. The tech was prescribed in the Imperium, but the Dark Mechanicum had no such scruple against it. These facts appeared unbidden in his mind, yet another bit of knowledge forced into him by call. He felt lightheaded, his vision blurred. He had his pharmacopoeia compensate for the machine's psychic bleed and held up his fist. His squad stopped. "Here," he said, "we cannot get any closer." He ordered his men to keep watch, while he tasked his targeting systems with finding the best places to plant melter bombs. Outlines blinked around various machines as he panned his vision slowly around the complex. The overlay added symbols to a few components. These flickered red. "Those three," he commanded, flicking out battle sign with his fingers and data-pulsing attachment points to his warriors. 3 Space Marines came forward, unclamping heavy fusion flasks from their thighs. They twisted the handles on the top, and the arming lights went green, setting them for remote detonation. The final was being placed when Totvan's threat indicators shrieked in sudden alarm. A huge shape charged out of a dark passage between 2 ranks of crackling engines, giving him precious little time to react. He threw himself into a roll to avoid a metal claw as big as his torso that buzzed through the air and buried itself in the asteroid's bedrock. Thousands of hours of simulations had drilled the movement into him until it was a reflex as natural as breathing, but the consequences of getting stuck prone stayed with him still. His power plant was heavy, and the bulk of power armor made it hard to get up quickly from the ground, like the colonians of ancient Earth. Falling on your back in a quarter ton of armor was a bad idea. His pauldron collided with the ground, his legs tucked into his chest. He shifted his weight over and shoved with his gun against the ground, swinging the bulk of his power plant round before it grounded and leaping back up as easily as an acrobat. The thing that attacked him confronted him head-on, a huge mechanoid unit as big as a dreadnought chassis. Through a thick viewing slit set into the front, he saw a human face contorted with pain and pierced by 100 wires. Gristly muscle threaded through the workings of its limbs, and organs pulsed alongside exposed mechanisms. The left arm carried the claw. It snapped open. Spinning, toothed wheels set into the pincers showered sparks. The right arm carried a heavy flamer. "Target heavy combat servitor, on my mark!" Totvin had time to shout, summoning his squad to his position before the flamer opened up, spewing a curl of promethium at him. He ran from the stream, and the servitor chased him with it, dousing the machines and the ground with burning liquid. The heat was intense, even through ceramite. Bolt rifles banged behind the servitor, and it rocked from the impacts. Totvin's squad attacked it from all sides. A second unit came through a kinked alleyway leading through the warp generators. Spall ricocheted around the open area. The machine screamed, a horrible voicing of pain, and it swung out its massive close combat weapon, smashing one of the Space Marines in the chest and hurling him into one of the devices. The impact crumpled the outer shell and shattered the innards. The warrior was engulfed in a blaze of lightning, and the biosigns projected into Totvin's helm went flat. Totvin fired, putting the entirety of his magazine into the thing's faceplate. The vision slit starred and cracked, turning opaque. Another bolt found a softer part behind the armor, blasting out a spray of gore and fluids. The machine screamed again, its heavy flamer spraying fire all over everything. One of his warriors was engulfed as he advanced into the space. Another was caught by the swinging claw, gripped between its pincers and snipped neatly in two. Shards of ceramite pinged off Totvin's battleplate. He cast aside his empty bolt rifle and drew out his chainsword. The blade roared into life. The machine swung at him, freeing his men to riddle its back with explosive bolts. Totvin leaned back from the blow, spun around and brought his sword down hard on the machine's wrist. Teeth shrieked, and a couple spat free. Chunks of chewed-up metal fell to the ground. The machine screamed again, somehow feeling the pain. It yanked its damaged arm back and fired its heavy flamer. A spread of liquid fire hit Totvin square in the chest, so heavily pressurized he was sent sprawling into one of the machines. His sensorium beeped warnings as the heat in his armor climbed to scorching levels. Warning runes blinked around his soft seals and joints on his retinal display. The ceramite plates were so hot his skin burned. His armor dispensed a rush of combat stims into his system, blotting out the pain and sending his pulse racing. He heaved himself up, still on fire. He barged into the machine with his pauldron, rocking it back, then brought up his sword in an upward cut, left to right. It caught and ripped open its armor, breaking the seal on its amniotic tank and cutting deeply into its warp-formed flesh components. The machine roared and punched down, but one of Totvin's men leapt for it, wrapping his arms around the elbow and hauling backwards. Another joined him, their armor ringing together as he grappled the arm, and the blow fell short. The machine turned, trying to throw them off, giving Totvin an opening. The flame still guttering on his armor, Totvin charged at the machine again. Leveling his point at the knee, he punched the blade deep into the joint and wrenched it around, shattering mechanical components and severing strands of gristle. The servitor collapsed, pulled backwards by the Space Marines hauling at its arm. It staggered, spraying a plume of fire upwards over Totvin's head. He ducked the burning wash and swung his sword around, hitting the left ankle hard. He sawed his chainsword back and forth until the foot bent inwards. The man-machine toppled backwards and rolled about, trying to get back up on its ruined legs. "Leave it!" Totvin shouted. "Withdraw!" His men ran from the field, abandoning the war gear and gene seed of their fellows. When they were at a safe distance, Totvin detonated the melter bombs with a mental command. Fusion fire erupted over the machines in a blinding dome. A large section of the machine complex collapsed. His armor's spirit had judged the demolition well, for the complex shook with secondary explosions, other machines following the first into death. But there were no more serious consequences, no howling more to drag them into the warp. He looked upwards. The oily sheen of the warp field dissipated, shriveling in on itself like plastic film on a fire. His sensorium feeds cleared, and the vox channels sounded true. "Lord Lieutenant," Totvin voxed, "primary objective achieved. The warp field is down."
They had been Adeptus Astartes once, though they were no longer fit to bear the name. They were of the same savage tribe that had attacked Fomor III. Blood-red armor edged with brass, chain weapons, a few bolters, everything festooned with skulls, either real or in cast brass, but hard to tell apart, for they were caked in age-brown gore. Plumes of grit erupted from the ground in precise patterns as the 7 Thunderhawks bombarded the enemy position from the other side of the ridge. Why they hadn't opted to strafe the positions from the air was abundantly clear now. The trenches had a wealth of gun turrets, many of which were anti-air emplacements. Deep trenches linked bunkers buried up to their firing slits in the ground. Everything was heaped with skulls and bloody bones, but they were sturdy despite their savage decorations. Antoniato took the magnoculars back from Lacrante, and the ruddy figure sprang away into the distance, shrinking to mites occupying cracks in the ground. "Unusual for the fellows of the Blood God to hold back," said Antoniato. He scanned around the Blackstone machine. "They're dug in really tight."
Your dead Emperor made them well. They might be maniacs, but it looks like they can control themselves when they have to."
Chilka had an alien-looking scope held up to one eye. "Nah," said Antoniato. "They're berserkers to a man. Someone else will have made those defenses for them. They won't be able to wait long. Good job, too. It'll be easier to cut them down when they charge out of the trenches."
"That's not going to happen. They'll wait, I tell you,"
Chilka said.
"This is going to be the death of us."
Antoniato grunted in amusement. Lacrante found them to be an odd pair. Unless he was flying, Antoniato was perpetually cheerful. Chilka ragingly fatalistic. He felt like a spare part around them. He was entirely surplus to their requirements. Even if both of them did try to make him feel welcome in Rostov's party, he was intruding into their friendship, and he still was not comfortable in the Xenos' presence. Lacrante looked behind him. He, Chilka, and Antoniato were sprawled on the sharp-edged regolith. Rostov was talking to Messinius a few yards away, surrounded by the Space Marines command squad and the 7 Null Maidens who had brought the gunships through the warp field. Space Marines were ranged in broken lines up and down the slopes. There were a lot of guns pointing back at them, but none of them were firing yet. "What are they waiting for?" said Lacrante.
"For us to do something stupid, which we will,"
said Chilka. "It's an honor thing," said Antoniato. "The followers of the Blood God admire martial prowess above everything. They want to prove themselves in combat against the new Space Marines."
"So they're doing something stupid,"
said Chilka.
"I'm surrounded by idiots because you're all human."
A loud crack reverberated through the asteroid's limited skies. The warp field blinked, then failed.
"Speaking of stupidity,"
said Chilka as she looked skywards. She and Antoniato got into a crouch and started to prep their weapons. A ripple of activity spread down the line. "Time to go, Lieutenant," said Antoniato. He slapped Lacrante on the shoulder and glanced meaningfully upwards. The heaving of the demon hordes around the strike cruisers changed as some turned back towards the asteroid. The ships altered their firing patterns, blasting out channels through the Empyrean's armies. The rearrangement filled the skies with falling, burning bodies and revealed the sides of the ships more clearly. The cruisers descended towards the surface, their huge hulls blotting out space. They entered the thin, false atmosphere of the asteroid, and their engines shook the world. As they came, their big guns opened fire, blasting at the traitor Space Marine positions around the Blackstone Device. Huge holes were torn in the ground, but the greatest threat to the asteroid was yet to come. Sparks of fire appeared all along the sides and keels of the strike cruisers, and the void filled with hurtling teardrops. The air was scant, but such was their speed through to the ground, fires flickered around them as the air was compressed into itself. Demons dived after them, trying to catch them, but they rebounded from their sides and fell to the ground. Now the traitor guns responded, stitching seams of fire across the air. Las cannons flickered. Shrapnel opened dull grey flowers around the pods and sent down brief rains of metal. A few were hit, some careening out of control, some vanishing into space. A couple exploded, launching their contents in pieces across the battlefield. But there were too many, and they were coming in too fast. The enemy could stop only a few. The noise was deafening. Lacrante had been spared the terror of a Space Marine drop assault until that point. The racket of it drove at him, making his heart quail and his courage fail. Were it not for Antoniato and Chilka at his side, he would have broken and fled, though the warriors coming into land were on his side.
The pods were fired like cannon shells. When they came within 100 feet of the surface, thundering retrojets burst into life around their sides, righting and slowing them to less fatal velocities. Still, they hit hard enough to kill mortal men, dislodging blasts of rock with their impacts. They landed close into the enemy defence works. Their ramps blew open to cannonades of exploding bolts, and the gathering smog of war flashed with their discharge. Space Marines leapt from their restraint cradles, guns blazing, and the enemy's emplaced weapons responded. The depression holding the enemy position turned into a boiling cauldron full of fire, smoke, and noise. Lecrante followed the progress of one squad as they sprinted across the broken ground. He saw one warrior hit by an autocannon and spun around. He fell, and his friends vanished into the smoke. The violence seemed to excite the Blackstone device, and it rotated faster, shooting out more of its branchings of green lightning, and these stirred the fog further. Messinius got to his feet, the giant power fist he wore on his right held clenched over his head. It ignited with a booming crack that drew the attention of all those near him. "Soldiers of the Emperor!" he roared through his voxmeter, his amplified voice godlike. "Forward!" With a shocking cry, the Space Marines on the hill raced down the slope towards the drop site. Fear spurred Lecrante up before his companions, forcing Antoniato to sprint to catch him. "Stay close! Let them go first!" said Antoniato, grabbing his arm. He, Lecrante, and Chilka ran in the shelter of a squad assigned to protect them. Rostov remained with the Lord Lieutenant, but he was close. "Those heretics down there could kill us without a second thought," Antoniato said. "But if we stick together, we have a chance."
"And watch out for them,"
said Chilka, who, despite her shorter stature and heavy burden, kept pace. She pointed up. The demons were plummeting from the sky after the drop pods. "There's too many of them. We don't have a chance," said Lecrante. "Yes, we do," said Antoniato. "Chilka and I have survived worse than this."
"There's always a first time,"
said Chilka.
"With death, it's also the last."
Chapter 36. The Redemptions of War. A chapter's errors. The engine fires. A berserker in twisted armor rushed at Messinius, chainsword held back to strike. Messinius only had a glimpse of him, but every detail was forever stamped into his perfect memory, from the flakes of dried blood caking the warrior's battleplate to the black iron chains binding his weapons to his wrists. His bolt pistol was so poorly maintained it didn't look like it would fire. His respirator grill was broken, as was the mask beneath, and Messinius could see the warrior's yellow snarl through the gap. A second later, he was no more, preserved only in Messinius's recollection. The berserker's first blow skidded off Messinius's left arm. He did not get a chance at a second. Messinius's golden fist punched the warrior in the chest, obliterating his armor, flesh and bone, leaving a smoking hole where his organs had been. Blood spattered all over Messinius's white armor. "For Sabatine!" he roared, and cast the dead traitor aside. It pleased Messinius that the traitors had erred as his own chapter had. When the 13th Black Crusade came forth from the Eye of Terror, and Cadia called for aid, the majority of Messinius's brothers had responded, trusting their chapter planet of Sabatine to a single company. In doing so, they left themselves open to an attack they were too arrogant to see coming, and the cursed sons of Mortarion had destroyed their world. Now the Scions of Khorne suffered the same consequences. The patronage of the Dark Powers was no protection against hubris. Massed Hellblasters opened fire, taking apart another bunker. The enemy defences were disintegrating, but trenches and heavy guns mattered little in this war of immortals. Demons were pouring from the sky. Those with wings flew down, but most fell, tumbling in red falls. The first of them splattered on the rock, dying on impact, their essences visible as they sped furiously back into the warp. But soon there was a pile of demonic flesh high enough that the creatures landed without harm and came rolling down the heaped bodies. At the bottom, they faced additional peril, for the ships of Battle Group St. Aster were firing on the surface. The ground shook so hard, Messinius thought the asteroid might soon break apart. Despite the fall and the bombardment, hundreds of warp creatures made it through the roiling impacts unharmed and bounded on hoofed feet towards the Space Marines. Messinius ducked the swooping demons. The Null Maidens drove them back by their presence, those coming too close fraying into black smoke from the pressure of the sisters' negative psychic auras. Rostov's band kept close to Messinius and his warriors and made good account of themselves. That was for the best, as Messinius had little attention to spare for their safety, being occupied with the cornate space marines rising up from the trenches. He sent forward a phalanx of aggressors to clear out the trench lines. Rocket racks coughed, their small missiles punching clean through corrupted ceramite and blasting apart the enemy. They swept their underslung flamers back and forth, flushing out more berserkers and immolating the mortal servants of chaos. But the Imperial advance, rapid at first, was slowing as more of the enemy warriors committed themselves to the melee. The Primaris Space Marines under Messinius's command were stronger and better equipped than their foes, but the berserkers had millennia of experience and the fury of a god to call upon. Ceramite crashed into ceramite as lines of blue-armoured unnumbered suns struggled with the blood-red and brass-clad followers of Khorne. Messinius battled at the forefront of his warriors, smiting down the hated traitors with fist and plasma. In the brief second between each encounter, he nominated targets for the cruisers above, and their lancers gouged molten tracks across the asteroid. Creatures bearing swords forged of flickering black fire crashed into the back of the unnumbered suns formation. Messinius had nearly a demi-chapter strength on the ground, a mighty force, but the demons were infinite. He glanced upwards. The Blackstone Device howled around and around, spitting out green lightning. They were close to their goal, but obstacles remained. He gave out orders to his men to hold the line, then pushed on to the forefront of battle, singling out a warrior for death who grappled with an intercessor upon the ground. His helm chimed to indicate a clear shot, and he put a plasma stream through the traitor's head. "We have to get to the device soon," said Rostov. He arrived at Messinius's side, his silver armor beaded in blood and power sword fizzling with evaporating gore. "We will be overwhelmed." Messinius nodded. "How much time do you need?" "A few minutes," the Inquisitor said. "That is all." "A tall order." "We must get through." Messinius searched the slope. Stairs led up to the plateau where the engine squatted, heavily defended. There was a way through, he thought, but first he needed to clear it. Only then could they recapture their lost impetus. He voxed the cruisers, requesting support. Bright dots emerged from their hangars. Interceptors, low-orbit insertion specialists with heavy gravis armor and powerful jump packs. They were slower than the drop pods, and many were attacked by the airborne demons. Gunfire lashed into the hordes, holding the demons back long enough for a score of the interceptors to break through the flocks and rush on flaring rockets towards Messinius's position. They swept over the fight, towards the rear of the enemy line, guarding the approach to the device, and though 2 of them were hit by ground fire and crashed down in flames, the others gunned down the heretic Astartes pouring down the slope, slackening off the press of bodies and allowing the Space Marines to push forward again. "This opening will not last," said Messinius. "Follow me." "Look!" One of Rostov's humans, Antoniato, was pointing at the Blackstone Device. Its orientation was changing. It was rising up onto one point and whirling around like a coin spinning on its edge. Colour drained from the fight, sucked in towards the artifact. Sound became soft and distant. There was a crackle, and black lightning burst from the topmost spear tip towards the fleet in the void. They could not see from their position what became of it, for the blast was swallowed up by the demons, but it betokened nothing good. "We have to go, now," said Rostov. "Keep up the bombardment," Athagay commanded. "Keep their attention on us." Hurried communications passed across the void between the ships. There were millions of demons around them. Point defense fire spat in all directions from the Centaster, raking across the choked void. They were half blind. Their weapons cleared past through the swarms, giving them momentary glimpses of the asteroid that were snatched away as the swarms closed up. The surface sparkled with gunfire. Their auguries cast out their sounding beams, but the information they gathered was constantly interrupted. Athagay could do little more than target her fleet's weapons where she thought they might do some good. It would have to be enough. They had problems of their own. Athagay watched as a Fury starfighter was ripped to pieces by winged monsters. One moment it was racing through the void, the next it was silvery flinders of metal. Displays detailing the disposition of the fleet's attack craft flashed red as more of her fighters were torn apart by simple claws. "Any sign of the Hellship?" Athagay asked. She could not let herself become distracted. The Hellship was a greater threat, but the demons held her attention, fascinating her as much as they sickened her. How many lies were we told, Athagay thought. All the time these monsters had been waiting in the dark to devour them. She'd heard the stories.
They were the Navy, after all, and they spent half their lives in the warp. But she'd been wise enough to give them no credence, at least not in public, for those who spoke too loudly of strange phenomena tended to vanish without trace. Now she looked at vid feeds of the demons clambering over her hull and wondered how they could have been so afraid to ignore what was in front of them. They couldn't be wished away. Purging those who saw them made no difference. "No sign of the hellship. Perhaps the initial bombardment drove it off," said Fingula. "No, it's coming. Keep your eyes open for it. All sensorium stations. Priority Optima." The demons had all the appearance of living beings, but they needed no air for their lungs or their wings. They were wholly unnatural, and the very sight of them carried a repulsive stench that worked its way into her senses from outside. Watching them made her head spin, and for once, when she reached for her box of powdered stim, her hand stopped and withdrew without touching it. "Emperor save us if they ever get in," she muttered. "Keep up the bombardment. Kill as many of these things as you can. We have to buy Rostov more time." "Eloise," Fingula was perturbed enough by something to forget they were on duty. "The engine on the surface is ready to fire again." "Void control, stand ready," said Athagay, dread growing in the pit of her stomach. "It's firing!" Sensing what was to come, the demon swarms parted. A jagged line of greenish-black cut across the void from the asteroid and connected with the Unmerciful. The tip passed through the void shields as if they weren't there and contacted the ship's hull, where it ate furiously into the metal, bringing forth a great jetting of gas and fire that pushed the cruiser off course. Lights all over it flickered, and its engine stack went out. The beam flicked off, leaving little tears in reality that bled blue and silver energy, space wounded like skin over which a sharp sword has been carelessly drawn. A moment later, the Unmerciful's reactor core went critical. A ball of fire 500 miles across swallowed its hull and annihilated hundreds of thousands of demons. "Emperor preserve us," said Athagay. "It's getting more powerful. Draw back, pass down beneath the asteroid. Take us out of the engine's sightline. Have the fleet close in. Concentrate fire on the swarms. Maybe we can take some of them with us. That will take us dangerously close to the rift. Then seal the shutters. We have to move. We don't stand a chance against that warp beam." "Inquisitor Rostov, he's on his own," said Athagay. "We're no use to him dead. The fate of our victory rests in his hands. Emperor preserve him." The bombardment ceased. The fleet was pulling away, yet the ground still shook with the engine's tremors. It howled as it rotated, screaming a song that defied reality's right to exist. The sensation of it sickened Messinius to his bones, but he forced himself forward, up steps carved into the asteroid's stone, towards the low summit the engine occupied. His command squad fell back to hold the stairs base with the surviving Null Maidens, their number now reduced to 4, for they drew the demon's anger and were forever the first to be targeted. Messinius climbed with Rostov and his small band, the Inceptors giving them aerial support where they could. The stair turned. A heretic came at him, chain axe roaring. Messinius braced himself for impact, but a bright pulse round sped past him and took the warrior through the left eye lens, and he crashed down, falling head over heel down the steps and coming to rest at the feet of Rostov's small Xenos. The White Consuls were not of the mono-dominant tendency and did not view all aliens with automatic hatred, but he found her loathsome nonetheless.
"Don't look at me like that,"
she said pointedly, patting her rifle.
"You owe me, Space Marine."
She pushed past him, daring to touch his sacred war gear, and yet he did not move to kill her. She had her uses. The dead heretic was the proof. The last turn of the stair brought them to a wide plateau with a large central well. It was over this that the lowermost point of the profane octet spun. It moved so quickly it seemed to be a solid sphere of grey and black, shot through with green lightning and flashes of red warp discharge. It made a deafening, burring roar. Machines were spaced regularly around it, in the manner of menhirs from an elder age. All of them bore the blasphemous marks of the dark mechanicum, and magi of that fallen creed attended them. There was more and worse to see. 100 brutalized bodies hung from crossed wrists, nailed into spines of Blackstone. Conduits rolling wetly with peristalsis sucked at them, conveying some essential part of what they were to the machines. At the center of the circle, around an inner ring of machines, stood a number of transhuman figures. It was hard to see their colors against the light, but the manner of their armor gave them away. Dark apostles of the powers in the warp.
Word-bearers, maybe, or others equally deluded and dangerous. They stood with their arms spread, their unholy totems held up towards the Blackstone octet. Power arced between them, the machines, and the spinning device. They did not see the party arrive immediately, not until the Inceptors rose on screaming jets and opened fire with their assault bolters, blasting machinery and their attendant magi into scrap. "We come at last to the end," Rostov said. "Chilka, Lacrante, Antoniato, with me." "What must we do?" Massinius asked. The priests positioned around the engine were turning to the source of the disturbance. As their arms dropped, the engine slowed and began to wobble. "In this pack is a Xenos device," said Rostov, touching Chilka's bag. More Inceptors were coming down onto the platform, raking the environs with their weapons, and he shouted to be heard over them. "We must attach it to the central machinery banks. It will do the rest. The mechanisms at the center must be preserved in order for this to work. The rest can burn." "Understood," said Massinius. "Lord Lieutenant, if you can, take one of them alive," said Rostov, pointing at the priests. "They will not break," said Massinius. "Keeping them alive is dangerous. Better they are slain." "They all break in the end," said Rostov. "See it done. I will be the judge of their danger and of their value." The power signatures on the Auspex suddenly began to move together, and shortly afterwards incoherent howling echoed down the corridors. The enemy charged. They were near mindless with rage, sprinting down the corridor into the face of the Space Marines' bolt and plasma fire. The first rank of them went down easily, flesh burned out by plasma strikes. But the others leapt over their fallen comrades, not caring that they died. Bolt rounds exploding off their ancient armor and crashed into the line of Primaris Marines. The rear was also threatened. Hordes of mortals were pouring up from the deeps of the ship. They carried nothing but mauls and lengths of chain, weapons that barely scratched the Space Marines' Mark 10 armor. But they threw themselves to their deaths gladly, the name of their vile god on their lips as they performed one valuable role for the masters of the ship, consuming much of the boarding force's ammunition. "Aggressors, fall back," Arios voxed. "Cover the black line." They trudged off. Soon they were among the foe, and Arios heard the telltale false thunder of power fists hitting unprotected flesh. While his rearguard fought, Chaos Space Marines were pushing his vanguard back. Arios's men responded by falling back. Warriors ran from cover to take up position further from the front, firing past their brothers when the opportunity arose. Apothecary Keshvinal struggled with a Primaris brother suffering from a catastrophic stomach wound. Tech Marine Desnius fired multiple plasma shots from his servo harness rig. "We must push on," said Arios. "We cannot let ourselves be trapped down here. Brother Chaplain Ganev, with me." The warrior priest nodded and ignited his Crozius Arcanum. "Throw them back!" the chaplain roared. "Throw them back into the abyss!" His Tech Marine and half a squad of intercessors offered covering fire as Ganev and Arios raced into the press of bodies. The intercessors stood in a line too deep, jostling with axe-wielding heretics. A couple of Arios's men went down, and heavy weapons opened up at the far end of the corridor, their rounds skating off Ganev's power field. Arios and Ganev crashed into a warrior about to deliver the death blow to a wounded Space Marine, their combined impact lifting him from his feet and knocking him back into the press of his fellows behind. Ganev used the opening to swing his Crozius into the breastplate of another warrior, breaking it into shards with a sharp actinic flash. Arios spun his power sword around, reversed it, and rammed it through the belly of a third. "The Emperor made us," Ganev shouted, "and bade us be strong to rid the stars of wicked beings. Fight, my brothers, and know that he is watching, and that he judges every man by the merits of his valor." The Space Marines pushed forward. Clean new pauldrons ground against armor grimed with centuries of innocent blood. The lines loosened a little, and what had been a scrum broke up into a series of individual duels. With more space between the combatants, opportunistic fire from both sides thickened the corridor with death. Arios found himself fighting a berserk Space Marine wielding paired axes. They had no energy field, but were heavy weapons of a tarnished alloy of such density that when they crashed against Arios's power sword, they held and did not break, forcing Arios to change tactics, employing his sword as he would a naked blade. The energy field banged and crackled with each strike from his foe, and these came in quick succession, delivered with a skill honed by millennia of war.
Arios found it pushed back by the press of his brothers behind. The chaplain's plasma pistol boiled the faceplate from a heretic, and he fell down, screaming from his fleshless skull. Two more came at Ganiv, one with a power axe, another whirling a flail weighted with brass demon faces around his head. Ganiv slammed at the axeman with his crozius. One of the energized wings cracked the helm, burying itself in the traitor's head. In the moment it was caught, the flail wielder wrapped the chains around the weapon and wrenched it from Ganiv's grasp. The dead axeman fell down, opening space for another to step forward and slash down with a two-handed chainsword. Teeth flew from the track as the chaplain's protective power field reacted, but it passed through and with a screaming, sparking snarl soared through Ganiv's armor between his left arm and his neck, down through his collarbone and ribs, where its teeth finally snagged and the weapon stuck.
"In the name of the Emperor, I give you judgment,"
Ganiv shouted. Blood poured from his vox grill. His assailant made to yank out his weapon, but Ganiv caught it, pinning him in place, raised his plasma pistol and put a hole clean through his chest, back and power plant. The reactor blew out violently, scything down warriors pushing in from behind. "Apothecary!" Arios shouted over the vox. "Keshvinal!" Arios sidestepped a blow from his own opponent, managing to hook the beard of the axe around his sword to trap it, at the same time raising his bolt pistol and emptying it into the chest of another traitor coming to take him from the side. For a moment he and his opponent were locked. He felt the metal of his sword creak. His sinew coils tensed under his skin, pulling at his natural muscles, working with his armor against the God-granted strength of his foe. The traitor was a monster, his arms bare, too swollen to take battle plate, and he laughed as he pushed down with his axe and raised his other to take Arios's head. The disruption field finally triumphed over the dense alloy of the axe. The energy of their combined efforts was suddenly released. The axe head flew away, and they crashed into each other. Arios caught the wrist of the hand still holding an axe. The traitor dropped the smoking haft of his ruined weapon and grabbed Arios by the throat.
"Emperor's dog!"
the traitor snarled.
"You have never fought a dog like me,"
said Arios. Almost too easily, his sword slid through the traitor's breastplate, destroying his primary heart. The traitor let out a grunt of pain, but held fast, squeezing tighter and tighter until darkness nibbled at the edge of Arios's vision. He dragged his sword across the traitor's chest. The smell of cooking blood boiled up from the rent in the ceramite. Armor banged and cracked as its atoms disintegrated. The traitor's grip fell limp when Arios's sword cut through his lungs and into his secondary heart. Arios staggered back under the weight of his defeated foe and barged him off the end of his sword. No more enemy came. They had expended most of their strength, and the remaining few were being cut down by angled fire, though they fought insanely to the last. The heavy weapons at the far end of the way fired at Arios's men, forcing them back from the corridor center. He dived down behind a pair of corpses, one loyal, the other a traitor, locked together in death.
"Hellblasters, clear the way forward,"
he ordered. His throat hurt from the traitor's grip. The ship was shaking from the discharge of its guns, and a shift in the pit of his stomach told him it was coming around to a new heading.
"The Blood King has been engaged by the fleet. We must hurry."
He didn't need to add that if they were not successful in taking the ship, Van Lescus would have no compunction in blasting them from the void along with it. He deactivated his helm overlays. It was then he realized the foggy feeling he had suffered since awakening was clearing. Looking around at his dead and dying men, scattered among the corrupted corpses of once noble warriors, he wished it had not. Chapter 37. The Warp Ascendant, Unholy Rage, Predator and Prey. Pursued by a host of demons that grew more numerous with every passing moment, the St. Aster had dropped under the asteroid and out of sight of the Blackstone Device when the Hell ship attacked. It came at them from the shadows, evading detection until it was too late. Its mouth gaped wide, and it roared, the sound disobeying the laws of physics, passing through the airless void, through the shields and the hulls, and spiking into their brains. Athagay's mind flashed white with pain. A terrible rage gripped her, and she fell howling into her seat. A torrent of horrific images flooded her mind's eye, and with them the undeniable urge to kill. She resisted. Others were not so strong of will, and small arms fire echoed from the far corners of the deck.
The madness lasted only moments, and the next she knew she was looking at true vid feed of the thing's open jaws racing towards the ship.
Brace for impact!
The St. Asta's gunnery captains were well drilled and got off a volley before the hell ship hit. Explosions flashed deep in the gullet, illuminating bizarre amalgams of flesh and machinery deep inside. Their efforts did nothing to slow it down. The rushing maw filled the vidscreen, fell off its edges, and filled the view with black. The impact threw Athagay from her throne. She toppled over the edge, bouncing down the steps, coming to rest against one of the railing uprights around the lower command dais. Metal groaned as the St. Asta was pushed aside by the hell ship. Alarms blared from every quarter. Men and women were scattered across the deck. Athagay got to her feet, bruised but otherwise unhurt. She was luckier than some. A number of casualties had resulted from friendly fire and the impact. Armsmen's guns barked as the last men gripped by rage were put down.
"Get me damage reports," she ordered.
Several of her mid-ranking staff were dead or injured. Her coterie of lieutenants were still picking themselves up, and she was forced to communicate directly with the various sections of the deck, reducing efficiency of command. She snapped off orders as she went around the dais, assessing her officers' wounds and summoning them aid.
"There are major breaches on multiple decks," reported one ensign.
"We have boarders, deck 14. Demons," said another.
"Send Captain Ulinius's company to deal with it," Athagay commanded. "We'll see how the Neverborn fare against the Emperor's angels."
She reached Fionnuala, who was at her station, blood running from a cut to her cheek.
"Ulinius is locked down on deck 16, Fionnuala said. "We've an incursion there too, and in 4 other places. They can't be everywhere at once. I could redeploy Lieutenant Iverson and his men," she said, looking back at the Space Marines still maglocked to the floor at the back of the deck. "Emperor's bones, no!"
Athagay swore, wrestling with the residue of the hell ship's rage still poisoning her mind.
"We'd leave ourselves defenseless. The enemy will be coming here soon. Just get someone on all incursions," she said. "Anyone. Sound the general retreat from the affected areas. Tell those who cannot get out to barricade themselves into the strongest compartments they can find. Seal off the decks, section by section. We can't vent the Neverborn into the void, but we can keep them contained for a while. What about the rest of the fleet?" "I've got no contact," Fionnuala said. "We've lost our primary comms mast." "Where's the hell ship?"
The howling screech of ripping metal answered her.
"It's got us. That's where it is," said Fionnuala.
The St. Asta shook.
"How can it even have an emperor-damned mouth?"
Athagay said. She mounted the steps to her throne, climbed up, and sat down.
"Well, it's big enough. Get a fix on roughly where it is. Tell the gunnery captains to blast it back into the void. We'll take damage. It's point-blank range," said Fionnuala. "I don't care. I want that damn thing off my ship."
Orders were passed down. The St. Asta was being pushed out of formation by the hell ship, and she was flying practically blind. Her auguries were damaged or scrambled by proximity to the rift, and for the same reason they were forced to close the oculus shutters as they were facing directly towards the deepest part of the tear in space. Looking into it would be as good as staring into the warp. A tense few minutes followed as the St. Asta's crew tried to restore function to the damaged systems and work out exactly where the hell ship was.
"Hold," she whispered to her ship. "Let the throne-blessed armor hold."
Shortly, reports came back from all over the St. Asta, giving them a good idea of where the other vessel was. Firing solutions were formulated. More orders were passed down to the gun decks. A warrant officer approached with a piece of parchment. "All guns report ready," he said.
"Then open fire," she said.
The St. Asta convulsed from stem to stern as her main battery fired directly into the vessel gripping her. Alarms wailed as the hell ship's teeth shredded armor and ripped off weapons. Pressure warnings sang from a dozen decks. Another rage-inducing roar reverberated through the ship.
"Throne save us all. It won't let go," Fionnuala said.
Athagay stood to issue further orders. Perhaps finding the thing's head would help, when the sudden triple bark of bolt weaponry boomed behind her. She was turning as the warning came from Lieutenant Iverson. "Boarding party!" he cried. The air was shimmering, opening up on a hellscape that, though barely glimpsed, would haunt Athagay's nightmares forever. Through it stepped muscular, long-limbed fiends, black horns and black tongues complementing black swords. Big as Space Marines, they set to bloody work, attacking the Sons of Dawn guarding the deck. A Space Marine helmet flew in an arc of blood over the bridge and bounced across the floor.
"We're lost," she said. "Forget the ship. Draw your weapons."
Melter bombs caught out the lock shafts on the bridge main door. Tech Marine Desnius worked at an open panel, loudly proclaiming wards against malicious scrap code and fell machine spirits. Internal weaponry hung smoking from its mounts. "Enemy groups coming from the rear," reported one of his men.
"Desnius," Arios called.
"Almost there," the Tech Marine said, the supplementary limbs of his armor darting in and out of the machine.
"The ship is not so corrupted. Perhaps it can be saved and re-sanctified."
He gave out a small noise of satisfaction.
"There. The Omnissiah smiles on us. I'm ready to open the door."
Gunfire started up some distance away. "They found our pickets. Mortals only. No heretic Astartes," reported one of the sergeants.
"Squads Icarin and Deimos to hold back," said Arios. "The rest of you form up," he commanded. "Firing lines against the door."
His aggressors and a supporting unit of intercessors headed back towards the stern to support the pickets. The rest, some 20 now, faced the door, half kneeling, the rest presenting their arms over their heads.
"Ready?"
asked Desnius. His servo arms raised up and swiveled towards the command deck gates too, though his human hands waited for Arios's command in the guts of the door workings.
"Ready. Open the doors."
Desnius twisted something inside the wall. Gears grumbled, and the doors shuddered apart. Brittle metal welded by the fusion boring broke with plangent tings. Where the melter flasks had taken out the locking pins, the metal still glowed cherry red with fading heat. The doors shuddered back into the walls. Stale air moaned out through the gap, spicy with age and long-finished decay.
"Seal your helms,"
Arios ordered. Grills in the snouts of their masks rasped closed. Darkness waited on the other side. The sound of fighting was nearing from the rear.
"Rearguard status,"
he inquired. He left the monitoring of the situation to one of his sergeants.
"Heavy weight of mortals pressing forward. Our warriors are holding the line."
"Then we go forward,"
said Arios. There was no communication from the other strike teams, but if they took the command deck, then the fight for the Blood King was as good as done. With the linchpin of the most organized battle group in the fleet dealt with, the rest could be divided up and destroyed. Arios had them go in squad by squad. Stab and lens lights panned around the space beyond. It retained the general shape and look of a similar Imperial deck, but was empty of personnel. Dust lay heavy on every surface.
"Where are they commanding it from?"
Arios asked Desnius.
"Here," said the Tech Marine, after a pause.
"Where is the crew?"
"They are at their stations,"
said one of the warriors, and lifted up an age-yellowed ribcage.
"Dead."
The men spread out. Everywhere was the same. Skeletal bodies in tattered uniforms were all over the deck. Many looked like they had died where they worked, though others lay face down on the floor, limbs flung out or covering their faces in protective poses. Many were missing the skulls.
"These are all Imperial uniforms," Desnius said. "What happened here?"
"Check the command dais." Arios felt himself drawn towards the oculus. The shutters were open, looking out onto a crowded void. Battle Group Bataris had forced its way deep into the enemy fleet and was engaged at all sides. Nova cannon shells cast from the guns of Alphas were still exploding, tearing enemy ships to pieces. But the Imperial fleet did not have it all its own way. Space flashed with bombardment as miles-long vessels exchanged broadsides at close range. So many void shields were active that the view shimmered and distorted. Torpedoes raced between the opposing sides. Though only part of Fleet Tertius was in play, the number of craft taking part in the fight numbered in the hundreds. The view was swinging about as the Blood King continued to maneuver. The entire scene tipped on its side and rolled over. The Blood King shuddered as it discharged another broadside. He saw the guns flash. Lance turrets mounted in front of the superstructure tracked targets and fired, all without the intervention of the command crew. The view shifted a little further, and Arios saw the unmistakable profile of the Precept Magnificat and its flotilla closing on the main body of the enemy.
"Van Lescus will destroy this ship. Gyrinus, get the Vox operational. Brother Tech Marine Desnius, are you sure the command impulses are coming from here?"
"As sure as I can be," said Desnius, consulting a handheld device plugged into a console.
"There's some dark science at work. Be wary. Rig the helm, weapons, and void shield controls for destruction. If the orders are coming from here, we'll stop them,"
Arios commanded.
"Squad Etienne, fall back to the rear and reinforce the others.
Desnius, get a message to the Precept Magnificat and tell them we have the bridge.
Lieutenant!
2 of his men had ascended up to the shipmaster's dais, on this vessel held far over the workpits and console banks of the command crew.
You need to see this.
Arios passed warriors rigging the deck for destruction with every grenade they had. Others took the more direct route of tearing off machine casings and wrenching out huge handfuls of wiring. Smoke drifted from their work, and the sepulchral silence was replaced by the sounds of tactical vandalism. Arios mounted the stairs and stopped as something brittle crunched underfoot. He lifted his boot from the powdered remains of a skull. Dozens more lined the steps, all the way to the top. On the command dais, there were hundreds of them, piled in dusty heaps.
Here, Brother Lieutenant.
The intercessor pointed to where the command throne should be. In its place was a rippled mass of dull brass. At the base, it appeared as metal curtains, as if poured over the throne and hardened quickly by some means. These took on more regular form as they went up. The hints of a great hand gripping the rest of a throne, a lump that could be the other. There was a chest, perhaps, shoulders, definitely, and clearest of all, a horned skull face with hollow eyes and a gaping fang-tooth maw facing towards the oculus. Arios looked at the captain. It was like nothing he had ever seen, either in his life before or in his long sleep. The mass of metal looked like an abstract sculpture of a great demon, twice his height and many times heavier, draped in cloth up to its neck. But it was not a sculpture. It radiated the same sense of wrongness that the eye things on the Ideos had, only more potent.
Whatever this is, destroy it, he said.
The dais shook, loosening skulls that bounced down onto the main deck.
Brother Lieutenant, look,
one of his men said. A black crack ran up the brass skirt, joined by others, until they raced all over the folded metal, joining with each other and widening. Molten light spilled from them, and the statue's fingers moved. Messinius could be rash. He had been told so since his earliest days as a scout. It was a tendency he had always had. He should have waited for his men, but he could not. The priests were too much of a challenge to him. He might excuse himself by blaming the baleful influence of the blood god's rage, which throbbed palpably as his own pulse around the device and its governing machinery. But he knew it was his own pride that saw him break into a run past the Inquisitor and pound across the polished Blackstone floor.
"For the Emperor! For the avenging sun!"
he shouted. He raised his plasma pistol and fired. The shot hit a priest in the stomach, but a flare of warp fire deflected most of its force, leaving his foe with a shallow burn across his battle plate. Messinius was quickly among them, trading blows with a traitor in a tall horned helmet with no eye lenses, only blank metal. It was clear now that all were word-bearers. Their battle plate was highly individual, embellished with howling demon mouths, but it was all the same color, a deep red bordering on purple, and covered in tiny script that crawled when read. Flaps of parchment bore more of the same writing, some with flayed hands or faces still attached. They were infused with the tainted gifts of their patrons, exulting in the power while it consumed them. Messinius understood then why the demons had been kept back from the rock. The creatures of Khorne had no love for sorcerers, and he wondered what hellish alliance brought the word-bearers into the service of the Crusade of Slaughter. His musings were cut short by the haft of the priest's staff crashing against the muzzle of his helm, stunning him. There were 8 in total. His armor systems ranked them all as high threat. Half were preoccupied by the Space Marine interceptors, firing at them from the edge of the machine plaza, and were moving to counter them. That left 4 for him. They were advancing slowly on him, arcane power burning around their force weapons.
I have been rash, he said to them. For that I shall atone when I return to the ranks of my brothers.
He sidestepped another blow from the priest.
Until then, accept this as my apology.
He lunged suddenly, taking the priest unawares, punching him hard in the face. The explosion caused by his disruption field shattered the traitor's helmet. The impetus of his feet took the head clean off and half wrenched the power pack from the traitor's armor. The priest fell down. The other 3 squared up to him. Without challenge or insult, they raised their arms and screamed out for the aid of their gods. Messinius charged towards them, but made it no further than a few feet. He was caught by black light pouring from the priest's staffs, which wrapped itself about his neck, waist, and left arm. It was solid enough when it had him, crushing him, but when he swiped at it with his power fist, the weapon passed clean through. The middle priest stepped forward and yanked his staff backwards, lifting Messinius from the ground. The bestial visage this one had was no mask, but was the man's face warped by chaos into something from a child's nightmare. Fire glowed in his eye sockets and skeleton's mouth, and he laughed.
Do you wish to call upon your false emperor so he may witness your death?
He said. He had no tongue. Flames licked around his chrome teeth when he spoke. Messinius tried to lower his left arm to bring his plasma gun onto the targets before him, but he could not. His efforts only caused his finger to twitch, and the weapon discharged without effect towards the engine. The Blackstone was powering for another strike, making the air shake and the outlines of his foes shiver.
Where is your emperor now?
The black tendrils squeezed. Ceramite creaked.
He is everywhere, fallen son of Colchis,
said Rostov. The Inquisitor appeared from nowhere, behind the sorcerer. His power sword hummed into life, then thrust through the waist joint below the traitor's backpack. The point scraped up and emerged through the gap above the breastplate. Matter shattered around it, blood boiling off explosively. The sorcerer turned to deal with this unexpected threat, but was dead before he completed the move, falling heavily and tearing the sword from Rostov's grip. One of the priests flung a bolt of writhing energy at Rostov. The Inquisitor made a warding gesture, but it was not enough to stop the blast, and he was thrown backwards. The distraction allowed Messinius to move, and he brought down his plasma gun far enough to shoot, burning a hole through the chest of one of the priests and killing his primary heart. The sorcerer staggered, his sidelight dimming. He fumbled for his sidearm, but Messinius broke free of the fading blackness, and with a mighty blow he broke the traitor's armor and flung him, dead, to the ground. One priest remained. They stared each other down. Orange luminescence grew at the tip of his staff. Messinius's gun had not finished charging its coils. He judged himself too far to make the run before the Psyker unleashed his power. A lasgun shot, plasma stream, and pulse round hit the Psyker simultaneously. Primary heart, secondary heart, and head. The lasgun shot failed to penetrate. The plasma stream burned through the outer layers of armor, but did not damage the flesh much beneath. But the pulse round was perfectly placed, taking the sorcerer through the left eye, and he fell dead.
Rostov Xenos,
Messinius said. The Inquisitor's hand was advancing behind him at a brisk, crouched jog, so fragile in that battleground of demons and engineered humanity. He had rarely seen such bravery, and they were deadly.
That's another you owe me, hero,
said Chilka.
That is a gun of the Tau,
he said disapprovingly.
Yeah? So what? The Tau make the best guns, better than the backwards tech you people cling to.
She shrugged and waddled past him to her master. Rostov was getting to his feet. His armor had an ugly hole in it, but he seemed unharmed.
Don't worry, my lord, said Antoniato. She's always showing me up too. The best shot I've ever seen.
The Blackstone Device screeched, sending them all reeling. Another discharge speared through the sky, this one hitting one of the Space Marine cruisers amidships. Its power cut out all at once, and it was sent adrift away from the asteroid, a million demons swarming over its hull and ripping to get at the meat inside.
We are at the point of victory,
said Rostov fiercely. His teeth were red with his own blood. Not wholly unharmed, then.
Chilka, bring me the artifact.
Chapter 38.